Hey there, Business of Politics show listeners. This is Eric Wilson. Wanted to share something special in our feed this week. I recently joined Michael Bassetta, who is the host of the Social Media and Politics podcast. He's an academic, has a lot of great guests. I think listeners of this podcast would be interested in his show as well. So go check it out. But I wanted to share the interview I recently did with him, and I hope you enjoy. We'll talk to you again soon.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Bassetta, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be talking about political tech incubators and investment funds, which is not something I was aware of just a few weeks ago, but apparently on both the left and right side of American politics, there are investment funds that are seeking out, recruiting, training, and investing in young entrepreneurs who are developing political tech that can help win races for these funds' preferred candidates. So on the right side of the political spectrum, you have Startup Caucus, which has just raised its second round of funding to the tune of $500,000. And on the left, you have a group called Higher Ground Labs, which is a bit better funded, but essentially doing the same thing on the left, investing in emerging political tech in order to help win races. So my guest to discuss this today is Eric Wilson. He is a managing partner at Startup Caucus and host of the Business of Politics show. A bit more about that in a second. But longtime listeners of this podcast may remember Eric from episode 23, where we talked about Snapchat and the Marco Rubio campaign from 2016, where Eric was the digital director and has worked on a number of Republican campaigns. So it's a pleasure to have Eric back on the show and share his knowledge about this investing space and political tech. And he has a podcast called The Business of Politics Show, where he interviews leading Republican digital strategists about the latest campaign strategies, but also the backstory behind how they became entrepreneurs and some of the challenges they overcame. So kind of like NPR's How I Built This, but the political tech version. So if you like the practitioner interviews we do on this show, then I highly recommend checking that show out because there is just a broader range of campaigners. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. You can learn more about digital campaigning from hearing a practitioner talk about it than analyzing hundreds, even thousands of Facebook or Twitter posts. But for those tuning in from the Business of Politics show, first, welcome. And here, it's a nonpartisan podcast, mostly focused on research, where we look at what are the latest studies about digital campaigning, about social media and politics, and, reporting the top line findings, but also digging into the ins and outs of methodologies and also the motivations behind those studies. So you'll find a lot of interesting stuff back in the archive. Feel free to check it out. But in this episode, we're going to talk about these political tech incubators. Eric wrote a great piece on what Web3 might mean for campaigns. So I'll link to that blog post in the episode description, but we'll talk about how campaigns could potentially use NFTs and the blockchain. And lastly, for the academics listening, we'll talk about whether Eric thinks we're on the right track, analyzing the content of Facebook posts and correlating them with engagement. So all in all, a great interview, something that I was not aware of, these political tech incubators, but a space to watch. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Eric Wilson. Again, he is a managing partner at Startup Caucus and host of the Business of Politics show. Eric, thanks for taking the time out and welcome back to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Hey, Michael, I'm glad to be back with you.
So to start out here, why don't we chat about the role of tech incubators in the U.S. digital campaigning space? For our listeners that might not be familiar with them, could you explain what investment funds and tech incubators like Startup Caucus do and why they're necessary to drive campaign innovation?
So as campaigns have become more technologically sophisticated, we have needed to put these innovations in private companies as opposed to parties. And one of the reasons that's the case is because the life cycle of technology in a campaign don't always line up. And so you need technology and products to be persistent. and looking towards becoming a long-term, profitable, sustainable business. And so the incentives are different than, say, a political party or a party committee, where you're just interested in the outcome of the upcoming election. And so what we have started to do, both on the right and the left, is create platforms for ongoing investment in these companies, a point of entry to welcome innovators. Because again, it may seem like the party should be the natural place for someone to come say, hey, I've got a new idea for a product, I need support, but they're not really equipped to do that. And so that's what Startup Caucus is doing. The Democrats have one of their own called Higher Ground Labs. It is much better funded than Startup Caucus, but we are working on different problems, and so different challenges for each ecosystem. But the fundamental challenge is creating capital markets for specific political startups, because we have very specific needs that aren't served by broader commercial software. And so that's what Startup Caucus is building.
Yeah, it's an interesting development, and I'd like to dig in more in depth, but with a bit of a global perspective. So last time you were on the podcast, we talked a bit about your consulting work in Australia and how different electoral systems can affect campaigning. So just take an example from there, because they had elections recently. Australia has mandatory voting, so that obviously affects how get out the vote messaging is done. So the point is, you're familiar with different political systems, and the role of donations and super PACs is so unique to the US. And I wonder, many of our listeners are based in European countries where campaign spending is capped. And I think that's generally viewed by Europeans as a positive thing for election integrity. So I'm curious to get your take on the role of money in US politics, particularly with respect to digital tech incubators. Are they a natural evolution of special interest influence, or do they have some positive democratic effects that more tightly controlled electoral systems may be missing?
So I think that moving to more technology and products and software is a net benefit to voters, because it connects the campaigns more closely with their voters. But let me back up to your premise at the outset, which is we in the United States, obviously the First Amendment protections are incredibly important to us, from everything from freedom of religion to political beliefs. And so, our courts and country have decided that people have a right to spend money on elections and campaigns. We have lots of restrictions around that and disclosure. I would put in context that we still spend more money on Halloween candy in the United States than we do our elections. So I think from a European context, we are a country of 300 million people. And so our spending is of course going to be higher. The other thing that I often point out is that, if you really want to get money out of politics, get politics out of money. And so as long as corporations and wealthy individuals and special interest groups believe that investment in politics is better than, say, developing a new product line or marketing, that says a lot about how involved the government is in making those decisions. So with that sort of point, I would just go on to say, obviously, campaigns are, I think they're worth it. I think, figuring out how we resolve these questions and who's going to be making decisions is worth that investment. From our perspective at Startup Caucus, we want campaigns to be run more effectively. And, we have seen that more technology leads to more transparency, more accountability. And so the more tools that we can give candidates and elected officials to contact and speak with their voters on a regular basis, the better, and the more we're going to see them do a better job of representing the interests. Let me just give one example, which is it is becoming more and more difficult in the United States to contact voters. So people skip over TV ads. The iPhone tells you when you're getting a political call. You can block spam text messages. Most of your political emails are already going to spam. And Facebook and Google have put significant restrictions on advertising. So one of the most effective ways that we have left to reach voters is through relational organizing. It's going to people's friends and asking them to spread messages on behalf of campaigns. Well, no amount of money can buy you more friends. And so that's causing campaigns to have to work harder to engage with supporters. So I think you are starting to see the pendulum swing, where certainly a lot of money has come into the political system over the last couple of years or decade or so. But there's a return to basics on the horizon that we're already seeing in several campaigns.
But it competes with the amount of spending on Halloween candy. But the reason I ask is because political tech incubators are not specific to the American right. As you mentioned, on the left, funds like Higher Ground Labs are pouring millions of dollars into campaign startups too. So how do you see that partisan dynamic unfolding in light of the broader tech competition between the right and left side of American politics? I mean, we often talk about the GOP kind of leading the way in the early 2000s with voter files and then kind of switching to the left with Obama 2008, 2012 with data targeting. So where are we at now, and what role are tech incubators playing in this digital political battlefront?
Republican campaigns run differently than Democratic campaigns. I often liken it to Darwin's finches, evolving on separate islands to deal with separate challenges and problems. And so on the right, you have a different demographic, a different base than what you have on the left. And so it's not a matter of sort of one-to-one copying what Democrats have versus what Republicans have. We all have different challenges because campaigns are run in different styles. On the left, you have their increased funding is driven by their donors who come from Silicon Valley, who come from startup culture and understand the power of making lots of bets and building an ecosystem. They also have a larger sort of nonprofit ecosystem that can support their business model throughout the year that's sort of missing on the right. But I think your listeners should know that once a company starts working with Higher Ground Labs, they're not allowed to work with Republicans. They must exclusively work with Democrats. So I've had, on campaigns, I've tried to work with some of the companies that have gone through that program, and they just aren't allowed to do it. Not just that they don't want to, but they're not permitted to do that. And so that's one of the reasons why we've had to build similar structures on the right to make sure that we're competitive with that. And I think that's a good thing, because anyone who has built startups knows how important understanding your customer and your user is. And, Republicans are different from Democrats. And it's very difficult to build something for both user bases. As you mentioned, our data files are different. Republicans use data trust. Democrats have a number of other platforms. And so again, just different styles of campaigns. We're solving different problems. And so it's natural that you're going to see this divergence in building the capital markets, the investments, the infrastructure for startups.
Yeah. And I mean, so far we've been talking about these political tech incubators in kind of broad strokes. Could you provide a concrete example of a success story from Startup Caucus and what type of tech you helped to put into the field?
Yeah. So our first investment was a platform called Numinar, which is an artificial intelligence platform that takes in voter contact data, enhances your model, and comes up with really accurate models around turnout, around persuasion. What is the outcome of a race going to be? And they're able to do that for fractions of the cost of, say, polling or a major modeling firm, because they're using artificial intelligence. So just to give you an example of how they came on our radar, and the timing was perfect, because we were just getting ready to make investments, and I just got connected to them because a former candidate that I work with was giving a lecture at Harvard University, where the founders of Numinar were still undergraduates, and they pitched their idea to him, and he said, well, you need to talk to Eric Wilson. So without that sort of incidental meeting, Numinar might not have been able to have the success and traction that they've had so far. And so that's one of the important reasons why Startup Caucus exists. We are the welcome mat, the point of entry for people who are looking to build innovations in politics. And so what we did with them, obviously we invested in them financially, but we also worked closely with them to help them meet new customers, to go through the process of becoming a preferred vendor with the Republican National Committee, which allows them to work with state parties, and then provide feedback on marketing, strategy, introductions, building networks. I think the most important value that we offer is as a network or relationship accelerator, because in politics, most sales are relational through people that you know and have worked with in the past. And so when you're new, that's very difficult to build. And so one of the most important things that we can do for startups and founders is accelerate their networks and introduce them to the right people. They are able to trade on the trust. So Startup Caucus really serves as a seal of approval for campaigns and political operatives. They know that if someone is working with us, we've kicked the tires, we understand what they're doing, that they're actually able to do what they say they're going to do.
Yeah, and I think the type of tech we're talking about here is super interesting, and it's maybe not always what our listeners might first think of. So, on the one hand, you had Adam Meldrum on your podcast recently talking about crazy innovations like audience segmentation with smart TV data. But one of my biggest takeaways from listening to the Business of Politics show is that your guests consistently talk about the need for tech solutions that streamline things like campaign organization and accounting. For example, I recall you and one of your guests talking about a kind of QuickBook for campaigns that's sorely needed. So can you discuss a bit those different types of tech? On the one hand, the kind of slick data targeting, and then on the other, maybe the more back office solutions that really seem to matter.
Yeah, so it is all over the map. Obviously, we've got sort of the core innovations around campaigns and elections, which are to reach voters, persuade them, and turn them out. And so that's things like automated content recognition, which is what we were discussing with smart TVs, being able to know what is on the display from second to second, and what can we use that for from a political application, to things like Numenar, which are building models and artificial intelligence. We've got another company called Swipe Red by Buzz360 that has an app for relational organizing. So there's that sort of forward facing. But then there's what we call vertical software as a service. So this is specifically for the political vertical. And for a lot of reasons, commercial off the shelf stuff just isn't going to work for campaigns. So let me just give you one example. CRMs, contact relationship managers, are priced based on how many people are using them typically. So if you're opening a business, you're charged $10, $20 per month for everyone who's using it. Obviously, on a campaign with lots of volunteers, lots of staff, that's going to become cost prohibitive. So we're working with a CRM called Determine that prices it based on how many contacts you have. So anyone can log in as long as they have permission. But it depends on how big your voter file is, your contact list, your supporter file. And so that's just one example of how it's an existing software application that's commercially available, but a different business model for politics. One of the other things that we look for, what I call spreadsheet problems. So there are lots of challenges in campaigns that are solved with spreadsheets. Anything that's a spreadsheet can be turned into an app, and then turned into a product, and then turned into a company. Again, let me give an example. Yard signs. It is a big headache for campaigns in the United States. You've got to make sure that you have enough, that you have them to the people who have requested them. That data lives in a spreadsheet. We're looking at opportunities to, can we build more apps and products to help manage processes like that no other business is going to go out and say, oh, we really need to work on yard sign management. And so if we don't build it, no one else is going to do it. And so that's an example of kind of the vertical software where we have specific needs or applications that aren't found in other industries.
Yeah, and going back to this idea of money and the kind of US-EU comparison, I think there's maybe a false perception that just because there's so much money in campaigns in the US relative to Europe, that there's like this infinite amount of resources. But, I guess streamlining something like yard sign management then frees up resources for other things like creating content and analyzing engagement.
Right. So I think, it is important for listeners to know, especially from a European context, that, there are different ways of getting the money into politics. So most candidate campaigns, so at the federal level, you are capped at how much you can receive from an individual. That is $2,900 US per election, so a primary and a general. And you can't get any more. It doesn't matter if someone is a billionaire or someone is, a family friend, right? That is the amount that you're able to give. That's one of the reasons why you're seeing more wealthy individuals run for office, because they can self-fund. That also kind of caps your ability to bring resources, what we call hard dollars, into campaigns. And campaigns themselves from candidates have significant advantages, both with the postal service, with TV advertising rates, with the ability to coordinate with other elements of the party, that super PACs don't. So yes, super PACs have the potential for unlimited funding from all kinds of sources. There's no cap on how much an individual can give, but they can't coordinate. They're paying higher rates for TV advertising. They typically aren't going to be able to build the infrastructure of like a volunteer core. So it is a challenge. Just, there's a lot of money that goes into campaigns, but there are restrictions on how much you can get. And so software is really important to getting an advantage, because the costs to run campaigns are going up. And that's because media is getting more expensive. It used to be the case where you could run a TV ad on the 3 broadcast networks and reach just about every voter. That doesn't work anymore. Those TV ads, in fact, are actually getting more expensive and reaching fewer voters. And so costs are going up and campaigns are looking for ways to become more efficient and effective. And that's where software comes in.
And keeping on the idea of funding, on the Business of Politics show, you often talk with political tech entrepreneurs about their business models and how to maintain positive cash flow outside of election cycles. So I'm curious to hear, what's Startup Caucus's business model? You invest in political tech startups and then you take a cut of their profits, or if they get bought out, or how does that work?
Yeah, so we are a typical investment fund where we take equity stakes in the companies that we invest in exchange for cash. We also provide additional services like the networking and the training that I mentioned. That helps us get a little bit more favorable terms in those deals. And of course, our network of investors are also really valuable as well for growing a company. And then when the company is returning a profit in the form of distributions to the shareholders, we would return that to our investors. And then in a couple of instances where there's an acquisition, we would then share those proceeds from that acquisition. It's still all in sort of private markets right now. There's not really, no one's a unicorn, no one's going public, no one's ringing the bell at the stock exchange. But these are good, solid businesses that serve a need in a recession-proof industry. There are going to be elections every year, no matter what's going on in the economy. And so we believe that good business and good politics can align.
It's one step closer to my dream of a political version of Shark Tank, but we'll see if that comes together.
We would that would be very, very boring because you could probably maybe only do one episode. I mean, it is a small market, very competitive, and just not a lot of people going after this space. So I think it's a really unique opportunity for someone who might be an entrepreneur who is politically inclined or even just politically curious to come in and build something.
And I mean, as we're discussing this, it seems to me that the whole idea of kind of venture capital for political startups is borrowing from a kind of Silicon Valley model. I mean, investment is as old as capitalism itself, but incubators are more of a tech industry phenomenon. So I'm curious to hear, do you think a tech industry mentality is shaping political organizing? And if so, what do you think this crossover between industry and politics means for democratic processes?
Well, campaigns are excellent startups, because you go from zero to becoming in some cases a multi-million-dollar organization in just a matter of a couple of months, right? It is this sort of pressure cooker, and we've spoken to entrepreneurs on the podcast in the past who talk about how their experience in campaigns prepared them to be entrepreneurs, not just in politics, but in other endeavors as well, because of that pressure, because of how lean and scrappy you have to run. So the culture isn't that foreign. Similarly, political spending is venture spending, right? Because you're taking big risks on outcomes. It's not a guarantee that the person that you are, raising $1 million for is going to win. You're trying to affect the outcome. So I think there's a lot of similarities between sort of the risk taking, the role of capital, and how these organizations scale. I personally believe that investing in for-profit entities that are going to be sustainable and last is a better long-term investment than pouring a lot of money into TV advertising, which is where most of political spending goes in the United States. As a political scientist, that the effect of those TV ads lasts maybe a few days to a few weeks after someone views them, whereas a good company can be involved in campaigns for cycle over cycle.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. But I'd actually like to switch gears a bit here. And we've been talking here and there on this podcast about Web3. And I know that's, speculative territory, but you wrote a fascinating blog post talking about how Web3 might shape campaigns based on a talk you gave at Campaign Tech East. And I'll link down to that blog post in the episode description, but I'd like to pick up on a few of the ideas that you were talking about there. And the first is NFTs, non-fungible tokens, and campaign merchandise. We've been talking on the show about how contests and prizes are huge for driving social media engagement, whether that's UCampaign giving out signed posters from Boris Johnson during Brexit or Norwegian parties offering sweaters with the Prime Minister's face on it. So how might NFTs be the next evolution of campaign merch and fundraising?
Well, let's dig into what those products are all about, right? It is showing your affiliation that you're part of a group, and it is unique or it's scarce insofar as it was tied to a campaign, right? So the value of a sweater with the prime minister's face on it is only high to a certain group of people. And so NFTs are a natural extension of that. They are becoming more readily accessible online for people to share their status. One of the challenges that we've faced in digital campaigning is that we don't know if the person that we're talking with on Twitter or Facebook is actually someone who's a voter or a donor, things like that. So it makes it really hard to figure out what level of engagement or interaction do they merit. Or are they just, a troll or someone who doesn't even live in the district, can't vote for you? NFTs, being able to show your affiliation and your support, even your training, doesn't have to just be monetary, but, what is your campaign experience? That's going to be a really important token for understanding who people are around identity. And then, of course, there's the collectability and uniqueness of it that I think we'll see. The biggest challenge facing the adoption of Web3 writ large in politics, and I think consumer culture broadly, is how difficult they are to use. I mean, this process of having wallets, I'm sure anyone who has done this has been locked out of a wallet, maybe has some money sitting in there that they're never going to be able to get.
That's me.
We still have a hard time getting people to complete the online donation forms. There's like not insignificant amount of errors there. And so if we're still having, basic Web 2.0 challenges, it's going to be a while before Web3 reaches mass adoption where it makes sense for campaigns to engage. Well, I think there's also opportunity going back to kind of that vertical software where there might be good applications for Web3 and blockchain technology that's not as wide or consumer appeal.
Yeah. And one of the reasons I like talking about it is because it does just, even though it's speculative, it does let us think broader than the kind of current model we're in, which is that kind of platform walled garden model. And I mean, the whole idea of Web3, at least for now, is that users, rather than platforms, would own their data. And that has implications for data donations through these crypto type wallets you were talking about. And that kind of seems crazy now, but it might not be that far off, especially with the EU's regulatory pushes towards data privacy and ownership. So could you discuss a bit how a data sharing or crowdfunding model might work for campaigns when these models are built on a blockchain rather than through a platform?
Yeah, so the biggest issue with data between campaigns and political parties and vendors is trust. The vision behind Web3 and broader blockchain and smart contracts is that we get to a trustless society. And so I think that's one vision where we'll be able to say, okay, let's say I endorse your campaign for parliament, and I have data that I want to share with you, like a supporter list or a donor list. Well, I'm really worried, what are you going to do with that afterwards if, for a subsequent race? Or are you going to give that to your consultant who's then going to sell it to other people? Well, if I can just do kind of a one-time share or smart contract, or even a smart contract that will know if it gets reused and can tell me, and then you get charged for that. All kinds of possibilities exist there. But what I think I'm most excited about is that, there's a huge startup cost for every campaign. It's really frustrating because we're going and recruiting and identifying the same volunteers, the same supporters every single time. That's really frustrating from a volunteer's perspective or even a voter's perspective, because they want to be contacted by the campaign, but sometimes the campaign doesn't have the resources or the assets to be able to do that. Imagine for a moment if you said, okay, here's my identity as a Republican voter. It has my phone number, my cell phone number, my email address, my crypto wallet for donations, here's my social media identities. Here's where I'm registered to vote. Here's my voter history. You know what, Michael, I'm going to go to your website and authorize you to have use of this through the end of the campaign. Well, that just saved your campaign a lot of money. So it might be a little valuable. Instead of trying to go recruit that person for $5, maybe you share $3 with them. So we've got a long ways to go, but I think there are a lot of interesting opportunities. And again, that creates a lot of incentives for campaigns to be more responsive, more engaged, more interactive with voters.
Absolutely. It's super interesting to think about. And again, I like thinking outside of the current kind of models we're in, especially as there's so much pushback. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, social media isn't all that new. We've seen similar developments in political radio and political television. And if we look at history, what tends to happen is that about this point in a technology's life cycle, then it's natural that regulation steps in. So I think we do need to think ahead to what might be open in the future.
Right. And what makes this particularly difficult to regulate is that it is, a TV station goes to the United States, right? With some overlap and the Postal Service. This is the first time where we're reaching voters with a really broad global communications platform. And certainly they're headquartered in the United States, but there are implications for what goes on in Europe and Australia and Asia with what we decide here in the United States and vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I have one last question for you. It's more for the academics listening, but I think you're the guy to ask for this, and it's something that we've been talking about at conferences, and that's about how we study social media campaigns and engagement. So we tend to measure a post's quote unquote success through getting higher engagement metrics with the assumption that there's something in the post that is driving that engagement. It could be because it's an attack ad. It could be because it has a certain emotion. And so we would draw a correlation and say high engagement equals something coming from the voters. But we also know that this data is quite bad quality and that campaigns are boosting posts. So I wonder, what are your thoughts on measuring post success through engagement metrics? Are we as academics misinterpreting data since campaigns, I suppose, are boosting posts on a regular basis?
I think what I would be more interested in studying is the dollars, right? So most campaigns are not just boosting posts to get them seen. They're boosting posts to get email signups, to get a message, to do persuasion. And so I think following the dollars is going to be the better measurement, because anytime a campaign, let's just zero in on Facebook, okay? Anytime a campaign is spending money on Facebook, they're doing that against a targeted audience. They may even be doing against a custom voter file that they are targeting. The noise and sideshow that is social media engagement, I think is really irrelevant, because you don't know who that audience is. Are they voters? Is it persuading people, or is it already converting the converted? There are just so many questions there. But if I were going to be studying this, the most valuable thing that campaigns have is time. Can't get any of that back. And then it's money. And so the money shows you where the prioritization is, not necessarily what has been done to provoke the algorithm. I think the other thing that makes it difficult, especially, and I'll just say this as a campaign practitioner, we don't know what's going to work or not on social media. You have ideas, but there is a black box on the other side of that with the social media algorithms that nobody understands. So it can be a little bit like, trying to figure out how a magic trick works from academic observation. You're actually missing something really important.
Follow the dollars. Well, now that our listeners are familiar with political tech incubators, they can do that as well and see what innovation comes out. So Eric, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. It was great to be with you, and always enjoy listening to the show, and looking forward to hearing from other folks. If they want to reach out, they can go to startupcaucus.com. That's the best way to find us.
I've just been speaking with Eric Wilson, managing partner at Startup Caucus and host of the Business of Politics show. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're hearing this episode as it drops, I'm currently at the International Communication Association conference in Paris, probably stuffing my face with cheese, but also looking for new research to cover on the show. So stay tuned for that. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmo. See you next time.